everyone, welcome back to my channel and welcome back to another episode of Tech Girl Thursdays. Today I am here with Alison and she's going to be sharing about her experiences in the tech field and giving some advice related to tech and data. So yeah, thank you so much, Alison, for joining me today on this Zoom call. Just to kick things off, can you introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about your background?
My name is Alison Pitt. I have a very varied background, especially when it comes to tech. So I have originally I went to school for engineering and spent some time in retail after that. And then more recently, I've done some work in financial-based software as a service. So it's been kind of a varied thing in my career. In addition to that, I also do podcasting on the side. So I do podcasting and content creation as well, sort of voiceover, that sort of thing. So kind of a number of varied interests, which I think probably we're going to talk about today. But that's kind of where I've come from. I've also lived in the UK and in America. So I grew up, I'm American by birth, and then I moved abroad after college, and then I stayed there for a decade and a half, and then now I'm back here as well. So yeah, kind of a broad a broad cross section of things going on there.
Yeah, I love that. All these like varied interests and stuff. And we will definitely dive into it as we get into this talk. I guess related to tech, how did you first get into the tech field?
Like I said, I started off in engineering, so I went to a science and technology high school. And so if you want to like go back to the beginning of my tech journey, that's going to start like eighth grade. Because in eighth grade, we had to take a test to get into the magnet school. And then from then on, the freshman year, one of our required classes was principles of technology or principles of engineering technology, which was a tremendous amount of fun because we either called it pot or poet, either one. It was funny. And that was in freshman year. It started off there. I focused a lot on physics and math when I was in school. Those are the things that kind of came naturally to me. So when it came time to choose a major or like where I wanted to go to college, I actually I went to Cornell University for engineering, which is a really good engineering school. I really enjoyed my time there. Part of the reason I actually went there was because at Cornell, you can you could back in the day, I imagine it's still the case now. You can kind of make your own major. And so if you have a varied number of interests, you can combine them if you want to. They encourage you to switch between majors if you find something that you like to do better. And they have, I don't know if you're familiar at all with Cornell, there's 7 different colleges within the university, and they have everything from fashion design to like dairy farming. I mean, and there's a hotel school. It's kind of, there's a lot of choice there, and you can combine things in a lot of different ways. So I went there because of that. Funnily enough, I never ended up changing from mechanical engineering. I just stayed with that the whole time. And then I actually went to study abroad. I went to study engineering in England, and very quickly learned that it wasn't really for me. So, which is a really interesting thing to have happen to you when you're like 22, 23. Because like I said, from the time I was in 8th grade, like it was all engineering. And I went through the path of least resistance, which to me was math and physics. And I kept doing it up until a point when I actually had to do it for myself. And then I realized it wasn't really my cup of tea. I'd always done things that were a little bit, more creative in my spare time. Things like drawing or painting. I spent summers with my grandmother, and she was really into crafting. And engineering just wasn't quite doing it for me. So I had a bit of a crisis of confidence, and I actually left England and came back to the States for a little bit before going back there. And I fell back on retail, which is, everybody has a retail job at some point, or a restaurant job, one of the two. And I really enjoyed retail. I really enjoyed talking to people and being hands-on. And actually, if you spend any time working in retail at even like a low management level, you start to realize that there's a lot of analytical thinking that goes into it, even just to how many t-shirts do you need to pull out from the stock room in order to keep your supply going, in the front of the store. And so because I was enjoying it so much, I learned a little bit more about it. And it turns out in retail, forecast planning is like a really big deal. And so I got into forecast planning at a head office level. In the UK, they call it merchandising. I haven't worked in the retail industry in the US, so I don't know exactly what they call it here. A lot of times merchandising can get confused with visual merchandising, which is like the people who do store displays, and that's a different thing entirely. But it was essentially forecast planning. And I worked in a couple of different businesses in the UK with a couple of different pretty distinct supply chains. So I did furniture for a while, I did homewares for a while, and then I actually did horticulture for many years. So plants. I started off working in a like a DIY multiple. So we were planning short shelf life plants across 340 stores. And then eventually I moved on to a mail order business that also did mail order plants, which is a totally, because then you have to deal with not only the plants themselves, but you also have to deal with the postal service,
Yeah.
which is a whole nother challenge. But, so it's sort of a natural progression you can see from like 8th grade science nerd up to, and it being in my 30s and sending plants all over the country. It kind of gradually changed. And so that's where I'm at with tech now. When I moved back to the States, I kind of had to leverage like where I moved back to, there wasn't a lot of retail industry. So I kind of had to leverage my skills, and I found a job that was as a business analyst for a software company. And so I sort of leveraged those skills that I had transferable. I'm not with them anymore, but now I'm looking to go back into a more data focused field that's like closer to what I was doing before. So forecast planning, analysis, and all that kind of good stuff. Yeah.
It's interesting seeing like that transition. So like from tech to retail, and then now kind of more data analyst type of things. And so that's really interesting. And what you said about retail having data analyst kind of things coming into it,
Yeah.
I never thought about it like that, but that's so true. Like it really does now that I think about it.
Oh man, retail's wonderful. If you are somebody who's into data, especially like if you're like a statistician and you're into forecasting and that sort of thing, retail is a really good industry to look at because first of all, you're always hands-on with the product and you work really closely with creative teams as well. So if
Yeah.
you are a creative type person who's into data, that will be really satisfying to you. Plus you get discounts. That was my favorite thing about working in retail is you always get a really good staff discount. So I still have stuff from back because I used to work for Gap years and years ago. I still have clothes that I got on discount from Gap and Banana Republic that I love.
You mentioned that like you're trying to get more into this data field and like business analyst roles and such. What specifically about data interests you? Like what made you interested in kind of this side of technology?
So I like things that are quantifiable. Me as a person, I don't feel very comfortable in that sort of gray area. There are a lot of people who really like qualitative things. Like poetry is a really good example. Let's go sideways into poetry, for example. In poetry, the words on the page rarely mean what they literally mean from the dictionary, right? You're actually using words as an expression of a different concept. And that kind of thing I have an appreciation for, but it's makes me really uncomfortable. It's very hard for me to sort of, get my head around. On the flip side, like I said, I always had an affinity for things like math and physics. And what I loved about those disciplines is that there's a right answer. I mean, you could get into the details of whether math actually exists. That's a whole nother conversation. But like, there's, especially when you're in school, like you can get in math and physics, you could always get 100% on the test. Like you could go into every single test knowing that you can get 100% as long as you get the answer right, right? That's not true of other disciplines that are more qualitative or more subjective. Yeah, so data, I tend to quantify everything, and pretty soon when you start doing that, you start to realize that everything is quantifiable, and it actually helps you make decisions in an informed way. If you've ever been in an argument with somebody who doesn't have any evidence to back up what they're saying, and it's infuriating because there's no like concrete way to it's exhausting. But if you have data, if you have a way to quantify something, then it's easy to present a compelling argument. Um, we talk about SMART targets. I don't know if you've encountered that yet, but the specific, measurable, achievable, RT. And it's the measurable part that's really key. It helps you sort of define a framework that you're working in, and you can say, here's my target, am I reaching it? And so once you start to kind of think about the world in that way, you can kind of see data everywhere. And data, it's one of those, the reason I love data so much is because it's applied to anything, anywhere. If you want to, like, if you're a musician and you're super into making music, um, you can be a data person in the music industry. I don't have any firsthand experience, but there are people who they need to understand record sales, for instance. For me, once I started realizing that data was everywhere, which sounds super cheesy, it unlocks a whole world for you. Then you start to realize that you can you can kind of leverage the other things that you're interested in, and apply data to that, and be successful. It's kind of wonderful. That's why I get really excited when I talk about data to anybody who doesn't get it, because it's kind of like it opens doors everywhere.
I know, I totally agree. Like, that's one of the things I love about data too. Like, data is everywhere. Like, every single thing has some data component to it. And
Mhm.
we live in such a, I guess, datafied world that, like, there's just so much data that's out there and isn't being utilized and analyzed. And there's so much potential to do something with that data, which is so cool.
And one thing I will say about data that both fascinates me and terrifies me, um, is because the, I, I don't feel in general that most people are extremely data literate. And when I don't know what the textbook definition of that is, but the way I use it is somebody who understands how you gather data, how you analyze data, and the conclusions that you draw from it. Data can be incredibly dangerous because a good analyst can make a set of data say whatever they want to, and that's a tremendous amount of power. And also a tremendous amount of difficulty, and that's why like I'm a real data advocacy and data literacy is something that really gets me going, is helping other people understand the levers that go into data and how you come to the conclusions that you come to. Data becomes fascinating when you start looking at those things because it's more than just the numbers. Um, the numbers are representative of a story, and it's our job as data scientists, data engineers, and data analysts to accurately then interpret that story for an observer. But it can also be done really badly and with bad intent. So you almost start to feel like a guardian of the data or the method. And that's part of the reason I think it's really important that we have a lot of people coming up in the data industry, because we are increasing the general data literacy of the population, and hopefully some of those issues will go away.
That actually reminds me of multiple things, actually. There's this book called How to Lie with Statistics, which I've been reading. And I mean, just everywhere, like in the media and everything, they always show these graphs which aren't, they don't portray the data as well as they probably could. And it's like almost like tricking people with the data, and they have this huge responsibility where they should be portraying and representing the data in this correct way, but they aren't. So you mentioned this earlier when you were introducing yourself, but what are transferable skills? how can you tell what your transferable skills are and how this will help you in the future as well?
Older people who have been through a few career changes, people talk about transferable skills. And for me, uh, in my journey, I've had a number of things that have like forced me to change. Like I haven't held one single job for a huge amount of time because life changes happen. So I had babies, I moved across an ocean, or there's a number of different things that happen from time to time that force a change in your career. And depending on your circumstances, they could force a career change as well. When that happens, you have to focus on your transferable skills. If you were somebody who focused on the fashion industry in New York City and you have to move back to Missouri, probably you're not going to get a job in the fashion industry in Missouri. And, nowadays there's things online and things like that. But probably you're going to have to change that. And you don't have to start over. That's where your transferable skills come in. Data is like the most transferable skill ever. If you are somebody who is literate in data and you understand it and you enjoy working with data, you can use data in any industry. And so I think that for me, that's a key of why I am so passionate about data now, because I've used it in so many different places that my data career as such, even though I haven't been a data analyst the whole time, my data career is like 20 years old by now, even though you may each individual, like if you had to ask what industry I was working in, each one of those is a much smaller chunk. Generally speaking, when people talk about transferable skills, they're like, can you do public speaking? Or can you manage a large team of people? Or are you agile and scrum and those kind of things are obviously transferable because they apply to any kind of business. But when you're talking about data, that's when it's worth your time to kind of do a bit of self-reflection and figure out what part of data you really sit in. They will then help you articulate that to your next employer or to your next set of employers.
Yeah, that makes sense. How
Mm.
can you tell what your transferable skills are?
You spend some time reflecting on the things that you gravitate towards naturally. For me, okay, first of all, I want to say that I've taken very many Myers-Briggs intelligence, the MBTI tests. I've taken many of them over my career, and I generally turn up the same every time. And so I know from those tests that I am a top level blue sky thinker, and I'm not particularly detailed. So for that one little aspect, that to me, that places me really well as a data analyst or a business intelligence analyst rather than something like a statistician, because my natural tendency, every time a data problem comes up, the first thing I ask is, how does this fit into the rest of the world? For me, I can identify that. I've watched myself do this in every job that I've had for the last 20 years. The first thing when a problem comes up is, what's the context of what's happening? And I even do this in my podcast. So I have a podcast where I talk about Star Trek news. And the first thing I always ask is, what's the bigger context of this small thing that's happening? That's a transferable skill. That tells you that in data, you're somebody who is an analyst. You're trying to place the data that you see in front of you in a wider context in order to understand it. Um, the opposite side of that is, if your first instinct when you look at data is to validate the data, or to what does each individual data point represent, that might be um, somebody who's more into data collection or engineering, somebody who's pulling that data together. If you are somebody who every time you see data you think, what could this tell me about the future, that's more of a statistician. That's somebody who's looking at this and looking to create a model that they can apply to something else, in a different place. So for me, it's all about reflecting on the way that you naturally gravitate towards things, that's your transferable skill. Um, and you build on that. Basically, every step you take, you just build on that a little bit more. You don't have to be good at everything. You don't have to be perfect at everything. What you should do, in my opinion, and I'm nobody, but what you should do is understand your own strengths and build on them and be able to articulate where you think you're weaker, because that helps people that you work with place you into a larger organization, and it helps you work as a team better.
So, like we've talked about how data can be applied to tons of different industries and
Yeah.
just different domains in general. What are some ways you've experienced this and seen this? And also, what are some things you've learned about data and like transitioning between industries?
One thing that's always consistent is if you are somebody who is super into data and you really like working with data, the first thing you need to understand is the data literacy of the people that you work with. Because for me, data is obvious. I see it everywhere. I see it when I do my grocery shopping. I know that we eat 2 cans of SpaghettiOs a week, and therefore I want to buy 4 so that I have enough to cover, in case it's a week we eat 3. I don't know. That kind of quantitative analysis is innate to me. It is not innate to everyone. And if you assume that it is, um, you could end up with unintended consequences. People don't understand exactly what you're trying to get at. I personally am somebody who likes to keep it simple. If you have to explain the concept of what you're doing to somebody for an hour before they can kind of grok where you're at, then it's not a very effective piece of analysis, because it introduces a lot of uncertainty into the equation. And so something I tend in fairness, I'm a top line big blue sky thinker anyway, so I tend to think like that. But my um, across each of the different industries that I've done, um, start simple, basically. As a data analyst, you have access to like all the data, like you have access to everything, and you should do the work for yourself to have cross-cut your data every way that you can and taken every insight and investigated every data point that looks a little squiffy. Like, you should have done all that work. But at the end of the day, if you think we should buy 47 blue things and 23 red things, that's the thing that you should tell the person that you're communicating with. And they don't need to know all the other stuff unless they ask. Basically, just keep it simple. The lines between all the different like disciplines in data are really squiffy, and they're squiffy to people in data, and they are even more squiffy to people who are not in data and they're just hiring somebody because they think they need a data guy or gal. So you can't guarantee that if you are hired as a data analyst, that that's what you'll be doing. If you're hired as a data analyst, you might be doing entirely data engineering. It depends on where that company is and what their needs are. So um, you you do need to be a little bit aware of that. Um, it's good for you to be aware of what your tendencies are, again, to be able to articulate where your needs are and where you fit in. But in terms of identifying how, like, what piece of that, just keep doing stuff. You might not know. And I can tell you, when I was 17, I was absolutely going to be an aeronautical engineer. I was absolutely going to design airplanes. And I could not be farther from designing airplanes in my career right now. Um, I things will change and evolve as you grow and as you get more experiences, and that's what you just need to do, is keep doing stuff and reflecting on the things that you do that you're the best at, make you the happiest.
So, talking about women in tech,
Mhm.
so what are some issues that you see women facing in tech, and how do you think in general we can like improve the woman experience at tech roles, tech companies?
Personally, for me, and I am not like a feminist scholar, but I can tell you my experience. One of the things that I have the biggest issue with women in technical fields is a lack of visibility of diversity of women in fields. So it feels like it's tiered. There's the hyper successful women that follow a pretty tight um, model. They all kind of look the same in power suits and really smart, and they hold high executive positions at places like Google and Facebook. And then it kind of feels like everybody else. And there's not a lot of I don't feel like there's a lot of diversity of the presentation of women in between. There's still a huge problem with supporting, and I won't say women, I'll say families, supporting families with children. And I don't know what that's about, because women are still bearing the burden of having, I mean, well, obviously we literally bear children, but like, there's a baseline that if there's a problem with a kid, the mom takes care of it and not the dad. And that I literally lost years of my career because I had to take time off for children, and that isn't fair. And I understand that there's issues around, like, well, there was a year and a half where I literally wasn't working. Um, but then do I deserve to be set back from my peers because I was raising the next generation of people who are going to pay for your retirement? I think part of that problem is that there's a lack of visibility of women who are doing it right now. And there's a huge amount of pressure for women who are visible to be perfect and have it all. And these are people who go to Pilates and yoga and have 12 children and are also high paid executives and do it all themselves, which is unrealistic for the vast majority of women. So, honestly, that's part of one of the reasons that I really appreciate the work that you're doing here on this channel, because I think that having women talk about their real experiences, across a broad spectrum is really, really important, because we need to be seen. I went through a lot in my sort of late 20s, early 30s, where I really felt pressured to be perfect, because that was what I had to look at. I was a perfect executive woman who could totally balance it all, no problem, or I was just mommy track girl, and I was never going to get above, maybe if I was lucky, I might be a mid-level manager, and I felt like that's not where I want to be in my career. So having women talking about that is super, super important. And I think that's the number one thing that we can do, especially for women of your age, to see the reality of like what that's going to look like. Because it isn't fair to also put the pressure on you guys that you have to do everything that you want to do with your career before you have children. That's an unrealistic expectation. And I also think that it's, why is that down to you? Why is it that women have to do everything they want to do in their career before they have children? um, and the expectation isn't the same with men. I don't know. And I do just want to also say, because my experience is I have kids, so I'm very centered on the experience of motherhood and navigating my career with motherhood. There is also a penalty for women who choose not to have children as well. And that's important to talk about too, which again goes back to visibility and having women talking about their experiences. Because if you choose not to have children, there's also a stigma around that in society too, not even to even start questioning things like transgender women or in any way non-conforming women. And basically we just need to talk more.
So, as a woman who has kids and raising a family, what are some things that you think tech companies could do better to support? I mean, I also haven't experienced this
Yeah.
yet, but just from like what I've heard, there is some support, but I feel like there isn't enough support and enough talk about it. So I'm curious what you think.
Well, first of all, I will put a little asterisk that the vast majority of my career was actually overseas, and I have limited experience with how employment works in the United States. So I'm still learning. My limited experience, I have seen definitely a shift towards more equality between, say, maternity leave and paternity leave. Like the last company that I was at, they increased the amount of paternity leave. I think we still need to make it normal, like some European countries do, where you can have a year's worth of leave and you can split that between men and women, and it's expected that men will take extended leave as well. This is just my personal opinion, but I think we need a tremendous amount of more transparency in salaries, especially in the tech industry. And the reason being that once you hit a certain point in your career, there's I think when you're in college they kind of imply that there's a constant upward trajectory in your career, and that's not entirely true. I think most people that I know, I don't want to say it makes it sound like they're stagnate, but that's not true. Some people actually really enjoy being a mid-level manager because there's specific skill sets at each level, um, of your career, and you'll actually find that you work best at a certain level. Some people will work better at a senior management level, some people will work better at a low management or even a not management level. Your skill set and your ability to do that job should be judged you against the ability to do your job. And that, if we could get to that point, then that would eliminate some of the issues that we have where people have to take career breaks, because it isn't just for children. Sometimes people have to take career breaks to care for an elderly parent or for a relative who's sick, or sometimes they choose to take a career break because they want to go hiking in the Himalayas. I don't know, but if your salary expectations are based solely on the length of service, and it's a completely opaque process, and people can't compare between different people in the office because they say it has to be a secret, you cultivate a culture of fear. And in particular with women, because we know statistically that women earn less than men for the same job, um, it's a huge culture of fear, and it leads to you feeling like you can't ever take any time off, and then you resign yourself to being less than, and then it kind of creates a negative feedback cycle. All that is to say, I think we could do a lot better by being transparent with our salaries. First of all, so that we know where we sit, within our company and within our industry, but also so that our employers can't play games with people, um, and allow that culture of fear to cultivate, which also like leads you to believe that you're not deserving of a raise or something like that. So yeah, uh, long story short, too late. More transparency in salaries is the one thing that I would really, really like to see as an improvement, particularly in tech.
So how
Um,
do you like create this work-life balance and balancing so many different things? I feel like there's like work, there's life, family, personal time. There's like so many different things that we do as
mhm,
humans, and
yeah.
yeah, just do you have any tips for balancing all of that?
I would, first of all, I just want to set the expectation. I'm not sure I've ever really fully had a great work-life balance. And I hate saying that out loud, especially in public, because I feel like that's going to reflect badly on me as an employee and as a person. But I do think it's important that we are able to talk about that. Currently, I'm trying to do work. I've got two children at home who are learning remotely and need a tremendous amount of support in their learning. And I have hobbies, and I have a partner, and I have a social life as well. Those things don't often all fit into a 24-hour day. Me, most of the time, I sacrifice sleep, which I'm trying to get out of the habit of doing, because actually you don't perform as well when you are not sleeping as well. And it kind of is, again, a negative feedback loop. Um, but mostly it's, for me, is about setting boundaries and I have a notebook that is my life, that I write everything in, because that helps me keep my mind clear and focused on the thing at hand. I try to not multitask. My favorite top tip is how I arrange my phone. I deliberately set up my phone, not with the like, it's not by how often I use it. It's by how important it is to me. So, or how important it should be to me. And I do that because it's just a subtle reminder every day of what my priorities are. So, for instance, on my home screen right now, my it goes healthcare and fitness, creativity, education, communication, local stuff that's like, stuff that's happening like in my neighborhood, and finance. And that's, just one of my screens. I have two screens that are like that. But it reinforces to me every day that the first thing that's important to me is my health and the health of my family. After that, it's my creative endeavors and keeping my mind active, and then education, keeping myself like educated and moving forward with my life, things like that. And if you have the opportunity to put little things around your life that help reinforce what your priorities are, and they should never be work, it should always be you and your person and your family. um, that will that helps alleviate some of the pressure and just helps make things better.
Moving away from, I guess, tech stuff, career
Mhm.
stuff, more into your hobbies, you mentioned that you do podcasting.
Yeah.
So I would love to just hear more about that, what you do as part of it, what your goals are for it.
A little bit of history. I came into podcasting accidentally. I'm a Star Trek fan, and I have been for a long time. I actually started playing Star Trek Online a while back, and through a number of happenstances, I ended up starting on a Star Trek Online podcast, and that kind of got me a new social circle and taught me some skills. And then that evolved eventually. I'm no longer with that podcast, but I still do Star Trek podcasting because that's the sort of that is the social group that I'm in now. When I first moved back from the UK, I didn't have a job for a while, and so I was freelancing. And one of the things that I found was most successful for me was actually doing voiceover and audiobook work. That was off the back of the skills that I'd learned in podcasting. And so I do that as freelance work as well now too. Now, fast forward to a year ago or so, so in the Star Trek space, um, there's a lot of Star Trek podcasts. If you're into Star Trek, there's a lot of Star Trek podcasts, and most of them are not, you can't even find them in Apple Podcasts because there are so many. But there's a really active um, a community on Twitter. But what was missing was sort of a rational voice in terms of Star Trek news, like things that are going on. And right now, Star Trek is really big business. I don't know if you're a Star Trek fan or if you follow it, but CBS is putting a tremendous amount of investment into the franchise and expanding the franchise, which has of course been a huge thing for over 50 years now. So there's a lot of stuff happening. So, and that was sort of where my interest lied. I'm always really fascinated by the production side of things, by the business of Hollywood. So I started a Star Trek news podcast, and that goes daily. And then I recently expanded to YouTube as well. So I'm on YouTube every day. But yeah, I've been doing that now for 5 years. And um, it's funny now because I now have the Daily Star Trek News YouTube channel, but I've also started my own where I'm starting to look now at the data side of podcasting. So it's where these two things are kind of coming together, because in my experience, a lot of the people that I work with on podcasting are not necessarily using the data to the fullest in order to make good informed decisions. And that's something, because I'm doing this on my own and trying to make it on my own and make it pay for itself. That's an important thing that I'm looking at is how can I look at my current performance and use that to inform, to make my show better. So those two worlds are kind of colliding right now, which is a really interesting thing to watch happen.
I love how there's like a community attached to it. And I mean, you've mentioned community a lot throughout
Mhm.
this whole talk that we've been having. So
Yeah.
I guess community within like the podcasting and Star Trek space, community within tech, community with like data angels. Like that's how we met each other.
Yeah.
Um,
Community is
do you have,
super, super important to me.
yeah.
I don't, I don't always slot in as easily. Like I don't always make friends as easy as I would like to. Um, but you know, and I will say particularly about the data community and super particularly about women. I found some really wonderful groups like Data Angels. There's a group on LinkedIn called She Loves Data as well. And I have been absolutely blown away over the last couple of months at how inclusive and how diverse the community of women in data is. And I think that's really, 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 really important, not just for us in data. And like I said before, talking about our experiences, but also, super big picture for the world. I have met women who are from all over the world. And it just, so I was a Python, an introduction to Python, because I'm just learning Python right now. Um, and this introduction to Python that was done from She Loves Data, who is from the Far East, but they have chapters now in LA. On the call was literally people in Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia and the Caribbean. And it was amazing to me is all of these women, from cultures that I literally have never met another person from one of these cultures. We all talk data. The context was the same and we had that common communication, and it left me feeling like I was part of a global community, that I had some way of connecting with people from halfway around the world, which I think is super, super important, not just in terms of talking about data and collaboration and furthering our science, but also socially it helps the world become a little bit smaller and helps us have more empathy towards other cultures and towards ourselves too. So yeah, it's really good. Reach out. Like I've just been completely blown away, and I don't know whether it's specific to women in data. All I know is that when I've been looking at, specifically women in data groups, the amount of diversity has just been completely mind-blowing to me. It's wonderful.
In general, what advice would you give to people who are looking to transition into data or tech in general?
Well, the wonderful thing about both data and tech is that you don't have to get anyone's permission to start using it. I'll speak specifically to data, although I think the same thing applies to any kind of field in technology because we have the wonderful internet. There is literally data in everything, and there's a really great Instagram account, which of course I can't remember, that literally this person just does a data visualization every day. And so if data is something that interests you, you can start exercising those skills and using them right now, regardless of what your job is. Even if your job is painting, right? You can start by measuring how much paint colors, like how much of each paint color you have, and graph it. There, you've worked with data, you've created a data visualization. Getting yourself into that habit is the first step into it's making data be innate in what you do. The first thing you look for is the data. A really good place to start is actually like I would say a really good exercise is to quantify your resume. And you may have already done this. I don't know what advice they give to young people now on how to write a resume. I remember when I when I learned how to write a resume, you had to type it on a typewriter.
Oh
So like, I mean, it wasn't that long ago, but it was still long ago that we not everybody had word processors.
yeah.
Um, and everybody still had dot matrix printers and typewriters. So but I actually went through this recently myself because I wanted to create something that was interactive. So I have an interactive resume up on Tableau Public. And it was surprisingly challenging, even for somebody who's worked with data for 20 years, to say, what can I quantify about everything on my resume? Doing that will bed into you that everything has a data component, and then you'll start to see data everywhere. And that's the first step, is just embedding yourself in a data lifestyle. And then educate yourself. If you are serious about leaving a current position and getting a new position in data, um, which I don't necessarily think is the only way, because a lot of times you can just start incorporating data into your current position, which I would encourage people to start with. But there is so much out there to teach you, and it's free. And I don't think it can replace like a college education in statistics or data analysis or data science. But I have a Tableau certification now that I got for free. I mean, I worked a couple of deals, but there's a tremendous amount of online resources, and you will find communities online who are willing to help you. And LinkedIn is a good place to start. I actually did a video on this, on how to keep your data skills fresh if you're sort of in between jobs. There's a video on my YouTube channel. But yeah, you can start now if you're really into it. Embed yourself in data, get your qualifications up, and just go for it. Find something that you love, and I can almost guarantee there is a project that will allow you to do that, and it will be in your spare time. But the one that I want to give a special shout out to is Viz for Social Good. And this is a group of people who volunteer, and they partner with nonprofits around the world, and they encourage people like me to do data visualizations based on real life data that then they can use in their nonprofits to help with what they're doing. And the first one that I did, and the only one that I've done so far, but hopefully it's the first of many, was with a group called Bridges to Prosperity. And they literally build bridges in underdeveloped countries, and it makes a tremendous amount of difference to the social and economic mobility of people in those communities, because they have safe ways to ford valleys, rivers, etc. Projects like that, if you can find them, I would start with Viz for Social Good. I know that there is data science for social good, there's AI for everyone, there's a whole bunch of these projects that you can join. And the best part about them is that they have active communities that are passionate about what they do, and they will help you, and they will connect with you, and they will provide you inspiration. I cannot recommend that type of thing enough.
But yeah, thank you so much, Alison, for joining me today on this Zoom call, and for sharing all of your experiences and advice and tips. And overall, this was just such an inspiring talk that we had. Thank you so much, Alison, for joining me.
Thank you so much, Shalini, for having me here. It was a real pleasure. It was a real pleasure.
Check out Alison's YouTube channel and podcast. I'll link it down below, and I'll see you all next week. Bye.